Good morning once again, and welcome to our webinar on student assistance in the Illinois 5 Essentials. My name is Dale Gasparovic. I am the Student Assistance Center Administrator at Prevention First. Just wanted to welcome everyone today. We're looking forward to a wonderful presentation by Patricia Berry, our consultant with the Student Assistance Center. Patricia has a number of years of experience in working with student assistants across multiple schools in Illinois, and we look forward to hearing her presentation here in a few minutes. Just wanted to remind everyone that our webinar today will be recorded and that it will be then archived on our website as well as our other webinars have been, and that's in our resources section of our website at www.prevention.org. You go down to Student Assistance Center under Resources, and you can see the data that we've collected about student assistance. You can see the archived webinars there as well. All of those are available for you to view as well. Beyond this one today, and there will be more coming on the 22nd of January. We'll be doing a webinar on a parent prom activity that another student assistance program has done, and they will be presenting for us about the who, what, when, and where, and how they came up with this idea as a student assistance program and how effective it's been for them in mitigating some of the issues around prom. So I invite you to join that webinar as well. If you have any questions during the webinar, please don't hesitate to ask those. I will unmute your mics here in a few seconds, so I ask that if there are any distractions outside of your office to please close your office doors if possible to minimize the amount of noise that we'll get. Also, you can ask questions in the chat box as part of the feature from GoToWebinar. So if you have any questions for Patricia or myself, please feel free to ask those at any time in either of those manners. I am going to turn things over to Patricia Berry, our presenter today. So give me just a second to do that, and we will go ahead with your information, Pat, and your presentation.
Sorry, Dale, I'm trying to get it to show the screen.
I understand.
Sorry, Dale, I'm back on you again. Okay, there we are. Hi, everybody. Today we're going to be focusing on the 5 essential elements and that connection with student assistance. What we hope to do is help our listeners understand the connection between building student assistance programs or building the 5 essential elements through student assistance programs. And we'll be doing that with data. First of all, let's just touch on what the 5 essential elements or the 5E framework is and why it's important. The 5 essential elements, or the 5E, is a framework of essential supports and contextual resources for school improvement. So basically, we're talking about a school improvement model. What's so important about this model is what research has shown about, oops, excuse me, I don't know why that popped up, so it's gone. What the research has shown, schools that are strong in most of the essential supports are at least 10 times more likely than schools weak in most of the supports to show substantial gains in both reading and math. Excuse me. Schools strong in at least 3 of the 5 supports also made significant improvements in attendance. What is also important for us to note as we go through the presentation today is that there is no one program, no tool, no narrow intervention approach that will be sufficient to build the organizational strength in the 5 essentials. It takes numerous paths, and no one course is obviously going to be best for all schools because schools are very different. So let's just take a look at what we're going to touch on today. So sorry about that. First, we're going to talk about student support teams in the school improvement process. Then we're going to touch on the 5 essential elements, a little bit of the background with that. We'll talk about the data sources and the questions that we used in connecting student assistance to the 5 essential elements. And then basically the 4 elements that are directly supported by student assistance. And we'll be breaking those down into different corollaries and showing the data that connects with those. Some important documents that have informed the presentation that you will hear today. In the first, I would suggest anybody read because it is so thorough in explaining the essential supports, the research behind them, and outcomes that can occur with schools when they are addressing those or building strength in those. That document is Essential Supports for School Improvement. The consortium sorry about that. Consortium on Chicago School Research at the University of Chicago. And I will refer to that as the CCSR at different points in the presentation. So that's been really an essential document in helping us to learn so much more about the 5 essential supports, about the breadth of the supports. Most people are familiar with the survey that was given in the spring, and schools have received their results, and now they're trying to pull some of those things together. And a number of people have talked to me about being confused about what some of those questions meant and thinking, well, if I knew what that question really meant, I would have answered it differently. And I think what can happen for us is, in a sense, a narrowing of what we understand something is trying to accomplish when we're familiar with survey questions and we don't have the breadth of what the research really can tell us about what all of that means. This document can do that. It's a very, very helpful document. The second document is the Pennsylvania Student Assistance Program Components and Indicators Handbook, which came out of the University of Pittsburgh in 2000. It was a published study that identified 23 standards of practice. Then we have the Illinois 23 standards of practice, student assistance practice, which was developed through the Department of Human Services, this University of Illinois Center for Prevention Research and Development and Prevention First. And then finally, the Illinois Association of Student Assistance Professionals annual reports from 1999 through 2013. Just some background on the essential elements. There was a school reform law enacted in 1988 that basically diversified, broke apart the Chicago public school system. At that point, it was all one school district in a sense. And it was then turned over to local control through local school councils. So the local school councils then were formed, which is similar to a school board for the rest of the state. And those school councils then had the opportunity to structure their improvement efforts. Many of them hired new principals Many of those principals, in fact 94% of the principals that were hired at that time, had less than 3 years experience. Many of them were first-year principals. They brought a lot of new ideas into the process. So over the next 10 years, there were a lot of different reform efforts initiated. The idea of the 5 essential supports was actually developed in the mid-90s as that research and documentation began to flow forth. The Chicago Consortium, the Consortium on Chicago School Research said, what is it that these schools that are now doing much better had in place? And how does that look compared to schools that did not make significant progress, or ones that even lost ground in this process of reform? So the initial framework was developed based on their evidence findings and compared with a lot of other information. That framework was then implemented in Chicago Public Schools to guide school improvement planning and self-assessment efforts. The lead group is out of the University of Chicago, and it is the Consortium on Chicago School Research. Chicago Schools provided the initial data, and then the contextual resource information, which shows how the school community and the community outside the school impact learning. That data and information, the expertise, was provided by the Project on Human Development in Chicago Neighborhoods, the Chicago Police Department, and Chapin Hall Center for Children at the University of Chicago. Let's shift gears just a little bit now and look at the student support team model, because this is also another factor in school improvement. Dr. David Osher is a vice president with the American Institute for Research, and he was a key figure in developing the Illinois Center for School Improvement. One of the strategies that he promotes is the use of student support teams in the school improvement process, improving school climate in particular. On February 27th of 2013, Dr. Osher did a presentation to the U.S. House of Representatives Education and the Workforce Committee. The hearing was about protecting students and teachers, a discussion on school safety. It came about as a direct result of the tragedy at Sandy Hook School. Dr. Osher made a series of recommendations in that hearing, and those recommendations were based on years of the work that he had done. But in particular, he cited a 2008 report of findings in the Cleveland School District. He recommended that schools develop an early warning and intervention system to identify potential mental health issues in particular, and employ student support teams to address those identified needs. So basically, during that study, they identified 3 strategies in particular that were important in school improvement, and one of those was the implementation of a student support team. In that document, the Cleveland School Report, student assistance teams, student assistance programs are referenced in particular. Student assistance is an evidence-based student support team model. We'll go into the 3 levels of service. So when we think of student support team, we think not just the individual core team, but decisions that are made by that support team in terms of services at all 3 levels. Student assistance focuses on the non-cognitive. SAP focuses on life issues that are impacting school success. Student assistance also has a foundation of 23 evidence-based standards of practice that were identified in the University of Pittsburgh study. Let's just briefly touch on the levels of service and the concept of point of need. All three levels are part of a student support team's work in a school. When we talk about strategies at the universal level, we're talking about strategies that impact the school population as a whole. That could be all students and all adults. Several of the strategies that we will talk about that impact the 5 essential elements are at the universal level. The selective level then would be targeted at students that are at higher risk because of their population characteristics. It could be the community area that they live in. It could be changing family, incarcerated parents. In terms of the 5 essential elements, the type of child that especially impacts development through the community context are those students that are abused and neglected students. And then thirdly, at the indicated level, and this is what we often think about in particular with student support teams, and this is for those students that are identified because of indicators that there is some social, emotional distress occurring, and that's impacting success in school. These 3 levels are, were developed by the Institute of Medicine. What's important in looking at the 3 levels is a comparison or perhaps a contrast with response to intervention. So I could clarify just a little bit. Student assistance is a point of need service rather than a failure to meet expectations. As with response to intervention, when all students get services at Tier 1, which are universal in nature. However, they're typically targeted at students when we're looking at response to intervention. We're talking about how instruction is delivered to students. So we have some strategies in terms of overall instruction, but basically we're talking about that initial instruction that's delivered in the classroom. When a student fails to meet expectations at that level, then they go into Tier 2 and get more targeted services there. With some schools that we have worked with, that's more in a group setting. You might have a study group out in the hall that there is a RTI interventionist working with. In others, we've seen them working individually with students at that level. But again, if a student fails to meet expectations at that level, then they will be moved into Tier 3. With student assistance, a student doesn't need to fail to meet expectations at the universal level in order to receive selective level services. Those services are received when a student self-identifies. They may sign up for tutoring, they may sign up for an educational support group, and it's because of factors that exist in their lives. The indicated level then is that student demonstrating those indicators. So again, when that point of need occurs, we don't have to wait for them to not do well with certain things. It's like, okay, here's the need. We're responding as that need occurs. Let's talk briefly about the data, where that data came from. The data was collected by the Illinois Association of Student Assistance Professionals beginning in 1994. The Student Assistance Center at Prevention First assumed that process in 2007 in collaboration with ISAP, not in substitution of ISAP, but in collaboration. So the data was still shared between the two. The reason it was assumed by the Student Assistance Center is because of the capacity to conduct the voluntary reporting process. In 2000, the inclusion of questions relating to the 5 essential elements occurred. It's important to note that this is a voluntary self-report. So a school chooses to collect the data and then voluntarily submit that data to ISAP and now the Student Assistance Center. The process was not conducted 2 separate years. It was not conducted in 2007, 2008 because the process was being aligned with evidence-based practice. So that took a number of months to do. It took about 6 months to do that. It was done between the Student Assistance Center and the Center for Prevention, Research, and Development at the University of Illinois. What we wanted to do was to make sure that the data that we were collecting was correlated with the evidence-based practice so that we could see that we were actually collecting evidence-based data. A school might submit a report. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mention the second year that it was not collected was in the spring of 2012, and that was because the Student Assistance Center was not open for about 6 months during that period due to funding issues. The report is currently being collected again. It was collected in 2013. It will be collected again at the end of 2014. Because it is a voluntary report, we take whatever data we can get, and we certainly encourage SAPs to submit the data when possible because the data has been extremely helpful for us. However, not every school has submitted a report every year. Sometimes there's no one in place to collect that data at a particular year, and then they will begin sending in that data the following year. So it's important to note that as well. On those reports, there are a number of questions, but these questions in particular relate to the 5 essential elements. Schools are asked to check all that apply when a statement is a result of having student assistance services in the building. When the report is distributed, there is a 2-page, fairly lengthy description for all of the questions that help people collecting the data understand a more narrow focus of how that data is being collected or why it's being collected. What is it we're asking them to look at? We don't have narrow, very narrow defined and descriptive fields that guide the entire process because that would be very limiting. So it's important to know that as well. The questions that related specifically to the 5 essential elements, a reduction in school-related problem behaviors occurred, communication improved between staff, students, and parents, parent education about support services increased, staff attitudes toward helping students improved, student support services improved, more positive relationships between students and non-familial adults occurred. Community resource utilization has improved. Life skill lessons are included in the school day. At-risk students are more effectively identified. Additional effective intervention action plans for students are implemented. Staff morale has improved. School climate has improved. Student conduct and attendance policies have been reviewed and or revised. Specifically, there are 4 of the 5 elements that are impacted by student assistance strategies. The one that we did not try to correlate was rigorous instruction or ambitious instruction, and it really focuses on the quality of the curriculum and the delivery of that curriculum. The other 4 we felt were good areas for making direct connections between our student assistance data and corollaries of each of those 4 categories. So it's effective leadership, parent-community ties, professional capacity, and supportive environment, student-centered learning climate. A couple of things that are important about these. What the the literature tells us is that effective leadership is really the driving force for the other 4 characteristics. Effective leadership has a number of different characteristics, excuse me, but in particular, excuse me, in particular, that excuse me, that leadership is inclusive. Excuse me. Let's go on to the next one. In looking at effective leadership, what the researchers tell us is that leadership that is distributive and inclusive is a stronger leadership than just having a central administration or a building administrator be just the driving force for change in the building, for improvement in the building. A corollary of inclusive leadership is that parents, community members, and faculty enjoy a real sense of influence over school policy. Student assistance policy, procedure, recommendations leading to earlier identification of students in distress. This is one of the 23 standards that it is a part of the student assistance program's responsibility when certain areas become evident as need, that those parts of the policy are reviewed and then recommendations can be made to administration. Examples would be especially policies connecting students to getting help, students, families, to school-based resources, to community support. And what might happen in that policy is something like attendance. And this is an issue that we've been talking about a great deal in Community Coalition over the last 4 or 5 months. And what we're looking at is at what point can we identify that a student is in distress and make a referral directly to the student assistance program as a result of a certain number of absences. So rather than waiting until a student has a higher number of absences and then connecting that student to the truancy services at the Regional Office of Education, doesn't it make sense that in-house we're trying to address that issue very early as it occurs? Another can be violation for fighting. And if a student is receiving in-school suspension for aggressive behavior or out-of-school suspension for violation of the policy, what methods do we have for helping that student and that family to get help? So that might become part of the policy as well. 46% of the respondents from 2008 through 2013 reported reviewing and or revising their student conduct and attendance policies. And just a note, a side note on that, typically when an SAP does review or revise their policies, they don't do that every year. So it would not be unusual for a school, excuse me again, to report that they reviewed their policy, made some policy changes one year, and then they don't look at that policy again perhaps for 3 or 4 years as part of a review process through the district. Evidence must consistently or constantly be brought to bear on what is working and what is not, and why not. If the ongoing multiple reform activities are to culminate in fundamental improvements in student lives. And again, that's from that document from the Consortium on Chicago School Research. What is important is what they're saying about evaluation is that you have to be diligent about evaluating strategies that are used in order to provide data to the whole to see what is working and what is not. With student assistance, SAPs have access to several evidence-based data tools and processes that allows that SAP to look at their service effectiveness and then use that data to add to the whole with the district, the building and the district, and looking at all of their efforts toward building the 5 E's. The second area is parent-community ties. And student assistance has historically, since the beginning of the student assistance model in the late 60s, early 70s, tried to be that bridge between families and communities. And it's also part of the 23 standards. There's several standards that deal directly with trying to unite students and families with community in order to develop services, in order to access services. So that's been an important part of SAP all along. Schools should draw on a network of community organizations to expand services for students and their families. Again, that's part of the corollaries for parent-community ties through the consortium on Chicago School Research. Policies and procedures that allow need-to-know information exchange with community services to collaboratively address needs of students and families. Again, that's a corollary of CCSR. In terms of the standards of practice for student assistance, several standards are directly connected with this work. Specific parent communication strategy is established. Formal parent involvement procedure is established. Supports and provide linkages for students and parents to access school and community services. Procedures promote student access to and compliance with school and community services and treatment recommendations. And confidentiality guidelines are well delineated, with team members demonstrating respect for and understanding of parents and students' privacy rights. What's so important about the standards is that there is evidence-based guidance for the practices that a student assistance program follows, so that it's, even though there's the diversification in how SAP is developed in different schools and what areas it addresses, there is still excuse me, an overriding standard of practice that tells us this is what we need to be doing in order to effectively serve the students and families in our building. YER represents the year-end report data, the year-end reports, and the year-end report data. The year-end reports include questions about how many families, guardians met in person with a representative of the SAP. Again, what we're looking at is school staff, that corollary of school staff reaching out to parents and community to engage them in the process of strengthening student learning. The year-end report also asks how many families, guardians not meeting in person received a phone call from the SAP. So again, that SAP can be reaching out to that family. However, we know many families that have to work more than one job just to keep the family together. And for that individual to leave that job in order to come to a meeting at the school, they don't get paid and they can't afford to do that. So when a family is not able to do that, what we're looking at is how else can we reach out to that family? What additional methods can we do to reach out to those parents? How many families, guardians not meeting in person or by phone received a letter, a form, a pamphlet about their child from the SAP? That includes support group notifications. So if a student signs up to be in an educational support group, one of the things that student is encouraged to do is to take a form to the parents that notifies the parents about what will be included in that group discussion. How many families, guardians receive general information, such as a pamphlet or brochure? One of the schools that I work with keeps student assistance brochures at a table at the office window, so that when parents come into the building, they have to go to the window first. SAP brochures are right there, along with a couple of other service brochures right at that window, so it's easy access for parents to get them. And then what is the total number of parents who participated in a prevention program this year? For some schools, that will be the entire population in terms of parents receiving information about prevention activities or parents who were on site participating in a prevention program. And Dale mentioned the webinar that will be coming up with the parent prom night, and they have a huge response, a huge number of parents that come to that event as part of that prevention activity, just as an example. In terms of data with parent-community ties, 83% of responding schools reported that communication improved between staff, students, and parents as a result of their student assistance efforts. 61% of those schools responding stated that parent education about support services increased. Now, what's interesting, again, is that many schools have not gotten to that point yet where they're sending information to parents, that they're trying to intentionally increase parent education about the support services in the school. Sometimes that takes a year or two to get to that point where they realize, well, we really need to be telling all of our parents about our support services. With a number of schools, this happens at their parent conference meetings. They have SAP brochures available, and when it becomes apparent that this parent or guardian would like additional help, that's when that teacher talks about what the student assistance program is and gives that parent the brochure.
Pat?
57% of respondents stated that their community resource utilization improved as a result of their student assistance program. For many, that means an intentional reaching out to agencies in the community, asking that question, what is it that you are able to provide for us? And can you provide services on site? Can you provide it through a grant without cost? So a number of schools have been able to access additional resources in their building because of reaching out to services within the community. And this is a part of the narrative that you'll find in reading that document from CCSR, that a major part of building the 5 essentials is developing those relationships with the community and then being able to utilize the expertise in the community to strengthen those 5 essentials.
Pat?
Yes.
We have a question. I have a support group for LGBTQ students who do not want their parents knowing about it. How do I go about this group dealing with such personal issues that students don't want their parents knowing about?
That's certainly understandable why a student may be hesitant to talk with a parent about that. I mean, the literature talks about that as being one of the major risk factors for this group is perhaps some isolation from support systems because of not wanting to communicate about that. And it's certainly a factor of personal choice. In terms of conducting the support group, it is, there is a strong possibility that that young person can be further alienated and isolate themselves further and distance them from the support service if that student is told you cannot be in this group without a parent permission form. As far as the legal requirement, that has to rest with the school. I can't say legally one way or another that there's a higher risk if you don't, for the school, if you don't tell the parents. So I think that has to be a decision between administration and with the student assistance team. In terms of that conversation, whether it's that population or any other population characteristic where there is some high risk, especially a conversation with the student in which you are able to offer support when the decision is made to talk to the parent about an issue. I mean, it might be pregnancy, it could be a gender identity question, it could be any other factor, substance use. We often encourage the students to connect with the parents when it's in the best interest of the student. In doing that, many of those young people feel that they will benefit by the additional support of that adult in that communication process. The bottom line for anything we do is the question, what is in the best interest of this student in what we're dealing with? So for me, that hopefully would help answer the direction that you might take with that. But if you have a little bit more question with that, please communicate that with Dale in the chat box. 57% of respondents stated that community resource utilization improved. What is again important to remember in looking at the data is that it does go from 2008-2009 school year up to 2013. So a school may have improvements in their community resource utilization one particular year. I might mark that if I've had a community member coming in to do an educational support group in the school. The next year that person is not available, and it might be because just funding changed and that position doesn't exist anymore. So I could report one year that it improved and not report improvement the following year. So 57% gives us an average over the years with the schools that report. All of this data is an average figure. So we see a few that are higher, we might see a few that are lower and in different years, but that's the average over the years. Within parent-community ties, schools should draw on a network of community organizations to expand services for students and their families. So in particular, this is a corollary that is important in developing the 5 essential elements. I don't think any of us would disagree with that at all. That when we're able to get services out of the community into the building where students and families have much greater access, students and families will use those services more likely than when they have to access those out in the community. The experience that Dale and I have had, especially in rural districts and in urban districts such as Chicago, we find that transportation can be a huge issue. In many of the rural districts, we're told that services are just not available. They're in another community. And the family is challenged by transportation, and they just can't access those services. And in Chicago, services, again, may exist in another neighborhood. However, factors can infringe on that. We've talked to schools who have issues with gangs, and the services that are needed are in another community where there is gang activity that limits the access of families from other neighborhoods being able to get to that service. So being able to bring the service into the building can significantly reduce factors of transportation and factors of neighborhood characteristics that can prevent service usage. Let's take a look at professional capacity, which again is a broad area. There are a number of factors that are included in that, and reading that full document would be so helpful with this. I'm touching on only a few of these areas. Quality of human resources is an important factor in professional capacity, and we all know that. Teachers' knowledge of subject matter and awareness of student needs and learning styles are central to effective teaching and learning. No one questions how important it is for an educator to be so knowledgeable in the subject matter that they are trying to teach. We often encounter a paradigm where an educator thinks about teaching a subject and does not think as broadly about the fact that they are teaching a child, not a subject, which is a very different paradigm. The paradigm of teaching a child is the one that includes the awareness of student needs, not just content, but what is it that an individual student needs to have in terms of supports in order for them to be able to focus on the excellent content that is being offered. The areas that we feel from student assistance that connect to this so broadly, so importantly, is that staff become much more aware of the factors, the non-cognitive factors, that impact the learning process. When staff become much more aware of those factors, what we find is that staff are more willing to look at what is happening with the student, and then when that student encounters difficulty, some distress or stress, other factors, they're much more willing to connect that student than with student assistance services. So several factors are important in this whole process of professional capacity, that we see that students have needs that are beyond the academic, that impact that student's ability to learn, and that we have a willingness, once we identify that, to connect that student to the help that they need, or to a professional that can make that help. We don't have to make a diagnosis of anything that we see with a student. What we have to do is be willing, whether that student is part of my classroom or not, to be able to connect that student with someone and say, I'm concerned because I see this, this, and this. Basically looking at indicators. Part of that is the sense of collective responsibility for all students in the building, the ones you see in the hall, the ones you might see in the cafeteria, not just those students that are in that teacher's classroom. So my willingness is that they all belong to me. I don't just think about, well, I don't have that kid in my classroom, so that's not my worry. All of us, as part of this professional capacity, need to have a collective responsibility for all of the students in the building. Strengthening professional community refers to close collaborative relationships among teachers, which are focused on student learning and coupled with strong norms governing teachers' responsibility for all students. Extensive collaboration fosters sharing of expertise to address the core problems of practice. So what we are looking at is basically the student assistance model in looking at a community, a collaborative community, sharing ideas, helping to identify problems that are occurring with a student or perhaps with that student and a teacher, and then being able to address that core problem by sharing the expertise that we have. I mean, that's the basic student assistance model captured in those words. The bullet with strengthening professional community is, again, part of that CCSR document. In terms of our year-end report data, 83% of respondents report that communication improved between staff, students, and parents. So again, that's an average over the years and with all the schools reporting. But really, that's a very high percentage in terms of looking at respondents saying our communication improved in our building between our staff and our students and our parents. Let's go on to the supportive environment, student-centered learning climate. The most basic requirement is a safe and orderly environment that is conducive to academic work. 72% of the respondents report a reduction in problem behaviors. That's a huge factor. As a result of their SAP, 3/4 of the schools that reported were saying we've had a reduction in problem behaviors. And actually, that's very logical, Because when we are helping students and families to reduce stressors that keep them from attending to the learning that is available, problem behaviors will decrease typically. When students are able to get help in terms of professional counseling, they are often able to reduce those problem behaviors triggered by that, whatever is happening with them, and then focus more on the curriculum that's being offered. 74% of respondents reported that their student support services increased. And again, that's a very important factor in terms of helping to provide a safe and orderly environment that's conducive to their academic work. Teachers and principals' personal concern for students and support from peers can build social capital for students, which provides a network of social relationships that offers moral support, information, and access to resources to help the individual reach his or her goals. So basically what this is saying is that there needs to be this network where students are aware that there are people in the building that are there for them, that are there to help them when they have problems. Also, they need to know that there are peers there that are available to help them. An important factor with student assistance is the self-referral and friend referral part of the identification process. As the SAP, we help students learn that there is a student support team in place, there's a student assistance team in place, or a student assistance professional in place. And then when we have concerns about ourselves or about our friends, that's a person that we can go to for help. They take us seriously and they help us in a confidential manner. So in terms of building supportive relationships, student assistance goes a long way in helping students understand, and then parents understand, that we're there for them. 70% of the respondents report more positive relationships between students and non-familial adults, basically adults in the building, has occurred because of the student assistance services. Just in looking at a brief chart, we find some interesting responses. We ask about action plans that connect students to positive adults in the building. And what's important to note is that from 2000, actually earlier than that, but until 2005, 2006, or I'm sorry, 7 and 8, it was asked in terms of the mentor, using mentors. From 2008 and 9 on, it was action plans using positive adults in the building. And that seemed to clarify much more, because people would think about previously formal mentor relationships when, well, yes, we're connecting them with this person or that person, but it's not really a designated mentor. And when we clarified the language a little bit, as you can see, responses were significantly different. Contextual resources would be a webinar on its own, so I'm just briefly mentioning that. It's a context that's unique to each school. A climate of relational trust exists within the school and between the school and the community. The school organizational structure is strong, and there are significant resources in the local community that are available to that school. What the research shows is that when the community context is weak, supports were also weak within the school. When community context was very strong in the community, those schools tended to make even greater improvements in building the 5 essential supports. Our time is about up, and I wanted to just ask if there were any additional questions that you would like for me to address before we brought this to a close. Dale, is there anything that shows up in the chat box for questions?
Nothing is showing up currently.
Okay.
I want to, if you have any questions, I'm going to go ahead and wrap things up a little bit, but if you have any questions, feel free to type those in or ask those now now. Wanted to, as I wrap things up for today's webinar, wanted to remind you all that you can always find out more about the Student Assistance Center and our work at our website at www.prevention.org. You can find out more about our trainings, more about our resources, and also you can follow us on Twitter, and that is at SACenterPF, where we make announcements of trainings. We also retweet interesting information that we see across Twitter that may be beneficial to SAPs and schools a lot, and all schools alike. So you can check us out on Twitter. Once again, that's at SACenterPF. That's the Student Assistance Center at Prevention First. So we will look forward to seeing you on Twitter, on our website, and hopefully at future webinars and training events. Thank you all for your time today. Thank you, Patricia, for the excellent presentation. And if you have any additional questions, you can always contact me. My email address is dale.gasparovic, that's GASPAROVIC, at prevention.org. And I look forward to discussing anything that you would like to discuss with me in the future. Thank you so much for attending today.